Hi, everybody, and welcome back. So, in this episode, we're going to talk about the media effects and how public narratives can turn a person into a symbol or what the headlines sometimes refer to as a monster. So, obviously, I'm throwing back to our mass media theories we've been talking about. Right, and how we frame someone who's committed a crime, and I have the perfect example for this. I'm kind of excited about it. New information has come out about this case. If you'll notice, you're still in my living room, so let's just pretend like we're both curled up on my couch talking about true crime. So, before we get into the theory too much, I want to set the tone. So, this episode is going to involve not just theories, it's going to involve a real case where real harm happened to real people and families that experience real loss. So, if you're listening here or watching here in a place where this topic could be upsetting, or if you're just not in the right headspace for it, give yourself some grace. Also, if you experience postpartum mental health challenges, please take care of yourself. You can pause, you can skip, you can come back later because our goal today is not judgment. Our goal is to understand how media shapes emotion. So, having empathy for someone does not mean that you approve of their actions. It just means exactly that you can empathize. And humanizing someone does not minimize the harm they've done. But what it does allow us to do is to conceptualize them fully, right? And here's what matters beyond one case in particular. The way that media frames good people and bad people shapes what we fear, what we fund, who we help, and what questions we're willing to ask. So today we're going to use the case of Andrea Yates as an anchor, not to sensationalize and not to a tragedy, but to examine specifically how a fear driven media framing can narrow public understanding. And there's one more note. I'm going to be really careful with language. I don't want to describe graphic details to you. And when I say the media, I'm not claiming that every journalist does this. I'm lumping something together that I know is made of different internal parts, and those internal parts may vary in their sensitivity. So I'm also not trying to cast a wide net and paint the media. What I'm looking to do is get us to think when we see coverage of different cases. So, we talked about these early media effect theories that didn't really give much room for empathy, mass society theory, the public's isolated and easily swayed by powerful messages. In behaviorism, again, people are treated as stimulus response machines. Ring bell rule, right? And then in positivism, there's a push to explain social life as though it were like a lab experience and we could objectively take all the emotion out of something, right? And under these frameworks, the media is very powerful and people are very weak, if you've noticed. So if the media showed violence, there was a worry that people would become violent. If the media created fear, people would panic. If the media named a villain, people would accept it. So hold on here. I want you to notice what's missing. There's no room for context, no room for complexity, no room for empathy. There's not much room even for the idea that audiences might interpret messages differently based on their own experiences, identities, education, and community. And there's really not much room for the possibility that fear itself could be a media byproduct, something we're constructing through language, repetition, and framing. So, when a shocking event would happen, these early assumptions the stage for a particular kind of coverage that treats the public as though they are emotionally reactive. And it treats the story as a morality play. Think like the Scarlet Letter or a parable from the Bible or some of the morality plays that you may have read about if you've been taking an English literature class. If you remember one thing from all of the various videos, I'd like you to remember that these early effects assume the audience is easy to manipulate. So, Andrea Yates became a national story in the early 2000s after the deaths of her children. To be real clear, this was an event involving profound harm and profound loss. The victims of this case deserve care and remembrance. But we're going to study the media effects, so we have to talk about how the story was told. Many of the headlines emphasized shock, the language emphasized danger, the imagery emphasized, and one of the most powerful cultural forces in the coverage was the idea of motherhood. Motherhood carries a very strong social script. We expect mothers to be nurturing, protective, and self sacrificing. And so, when a woman commits harm against her own children, the story often becomes, how could a mother do this? What kind of woman could she possibly be? What's wrong with her? And a lot of times we go over into monster territory. Oh, she must be monstrous. That framing turns motherhood itself into a weapon. And at the time, in the 2000s especially, mental illness can get flattened into a threat. So I actually had my children around the same time as Andrea Yates, and I watched the trial unfold. And I also experienced postpartum issues after every single one of my children and before. And I can tell you that postpartum mental health before Andrea Yates was not something your doctor asked you about. It wasn't something that you regularly got care for. Now, after Andrea Yates, especially here, the medical establishment absolutely realized what had happened here, and everyone began screening new mothers for postpartum. She created an entire conversation that began happening about how we take care of new mothers. Because social script is you have your new baby, you're supposed to be delighted with your new baby, you're supposed to love your new baby, and it's supposed to be the best thing that ever happened to you. And if you're struggling with postpartum emotions and depression, you can feel guilty for having those feelings. And instead of being able to reach out and get help at the time, there was a, what's wrong with you if you're not happy mentality to motherhood. And so so glad to see that the conversation has changed now and that we're much more sensitive to mental health. But we have to go back in our magical time machine and realize that at the time that this crime happened, mental health was a fully different system. It was a fully different idea. It was not well accepted. Just didn't think of mental health in the ways that we think of it now. So, her mental illness, she actually had postpartum psychosis. So, you have to understand, and if you want to pause this and look up postpartum psychosis, psychosis is when you have fully lost touch with reality. She was fully unaware of what she was doing. There is a lot of nuance to postpartum problems because if you met someone who was fully psychotic, you'd be like, that person has left the planet we all live on and is somewhere else. The problem with postpartum psychosis is that it's a real problem for you when you're postpartum, But then once you're no longer postpartum, you become normal again. And so that is great and terrible all at the same time because what you did when you were psychotic, you have to deal with once you're back in your right mind. So during this time, mental health hospitals existed, but they were not great. There were huge treatment gaps. Insurance didn't treat people the way they treat people now. There was just a lot of things falling through the cracks. And to add to this particular case, there's also a religious aspect in which many accounts become either a simplistic explanation, a dramatic backdrop, rather than a complex view of a family's worldview, community, and decision making environment. So there is a new documentary that is on HBO right now, all about the cult that she was involved in. I needed a drink. And so, to give you some perspective, she was in an incredibly fundamentalist, shame based version of the religion she practiced. And the guy who she considered to be a prophet who spoke directly with God, sending her individualized cassette tapes that were like shame grenades that go off. So that really a perfect storm when she got into postpartum psychosis. Those tapes became the content of a lot of her delusions. So at the time, everyone wanted the death penalty for her. And the audience wasn't really invited to ask the question, how does something like this happen? It was really all a reaction. So all of the news coverage was very shock value. All of the things that were played, I don't know what was recorded, but what was played at the time were people who just could not believe what had happened. And even the police, if you look at the police from the time and what they were talking about on camera, they were even calling her a monster. And so the thing is, fear does something very specific in our brains. It's one of the reasons why it's really hard if you're going to do public speaking, because fear oversimplifies everything. Once you get into a fear situation, fight or flight, necessarily, because if there is a grizzly bear behind me, this is a great system. It focuses my attention on what I fear, right? It demands that I put distance between myself and what I fear. There is no curiosity or creativity once fear is activated. So, Andrea Yates was frequently framed not as an individual in a mental health crisis, but as a symbol, a warning, a monster. And if you're operating inside early effect assumption, that's enough. It makes her a very clear villain and it creates a very clear emotional response to her. But that clarity comes at a cost because it's not just a storytelling choice. This is someone's life. People wanted to request capital punishment and not even entertain an insanity defense. So, when people talk about media effects, they often mean imitation or moral decay. If people see violence, they'll become violent. But in cases like this, a different effect is often more powerful. The effect is emotional closure. The monster framing means I get to smack a label on this and put it in a shelf in my brain, and I don't have to think about the complexity of it. And that's great for some people, but it's not great for the human at the center of this, and it's not even great for the victims. So the monster framing allows the audience to stop thinking. If she is an inhumane monster, we don't have to ask about postpartum psychosis. We don't have to worry about our neighbor. When she has a child, we don't have to check in on our aunt or our niece or whoever just had a baby and try to see how they're doing. If she's evil, We don't even have to look at the social failures of the mental health system, the insurance system we have for mental health, the way we treat people in mental health hospitals. If she's an exception, we don't have to look at anything. And these systems matter because having access to good mental health care, the stigma around postpartum symptoms, family and community support, how medical professionals respond to warning signs, and how religious or cultural beliefs shape decisions about treatment, how media coverage influences policy and public empathy are all profoundly important issues that are going to affect every woman who has a child after, every woman who experiences a postpartum event. So, fear produces distance, and distance protects the view. So, when our media does this for us, isn't it just a neat little package? It's not messy, it's not human. It's just in a little bow and we put it on the shelf and I'm done. And I can feel better about myself now because I'm not that monster. That's not a solid way to go through life. So, when someone is a monster, if we could learn anything from literature, please read the novel Frankenstein. Please read The Scarlet Letter, the whole thing, not in choppy little segments for a test or something. Read the whole thing because every time in literature we paint someone as a monster, what we wind up finding out is they're not really the monsters we are. So, if a person is a monster, then everything's very contained and it's not about us and it's not about our communities and it's not nothing fragile in the system. It's just this one aberrant human who couldn't keep it together, right? And it also shapes what the public's possible. So if the public learns this is what mental illness looks like, they may fear people who are struggling with mental health, right? And they may start shaming people who have postpartum suffering. Because remember, what these theories leave out is the suffering of the humans at the center of it. So, also, if we make this person a monster and we say this is just some rare aberrant event, what we're not going to do, fund better mental health postpartum interventions. So the effect isn't just emotional inside of you. This is a societal effect that it has on us. It influences what we talk about, what we ignore, and what we demand from our institutions. So, what do we do with this, especially if you're a student learning this or a listener trying to stay human in a high volume news cycle? Empathy here is not about feeling sorry. It's about resisting empathy says, I can hold horror and humanity at the same time. Empathy says, understanding you does not excuse the outcome. And empathy says, I'm not going to let fear do my thinking for me. And that's a skill. And like any skill, it can be practiced. And here are a few ways to practice it. When you're watching news stories, documentaries, notice the frame. If words are being used like monster, evil, psycho, cold blooded, what do those words do to your ability to think it through? And also separate facts from interpretation. What is actually confirmed and agreed upon by all sides? What's implied? And what is being speculated about? Because one of the things about the true crime genre as it currently exists, and this is 2026 for a frame of reference, is we're getting into a gray area between facts and speculation, between documentary and drama. So we're getting into some places where entertainment is what's being focused on, and that's great. But you also have to know that if entertainment is the focus, then probably there's some context that's missing. Resist the comfort of distance. Resist that urge to look away and not focus on what's happening and understand that you can hold someone accountable and find them to be a complex human being. And that's really the work that I'm going to ask you to do in this course is not to erase harm, not to excuse harm, but to understand how narratives shape what we feel and what we're willing to learn about. Okay? So, here's one question I would like you to sit with. When a story makes you feel fear, or what questions become harder to ask for you? And who benefits from your silence? So, I'd love to hear your comments. And I'd also like you to think about what is a story you remember where the monster frame showed up fast? And what did that framing make you want to stop wondering about? And your student in my class, consider this your listening note. Identify one moment where the story invites reaction instead of reflection. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.